Hello, and welcome to your lecture on social organization and warfare. Now, in order to have warfare, we have to have groups competing with one another. And as we know from our lectures so far, cultural groups certainly exist. However, the differences between cultural groups are almost entirely cultural, as we remember from our lecture on race, ethnicity, and class. So this graph is showing you the percentage of differences between groups as it has been measured around the world. And all the gray bars are cultural differences and all the black bars are biological differences. So that what you can see is there's a minuscule amount of variation between groups that can be ascribed to biological differences, and by far the majority of the differences that we observe in humans are cultural. And in fact, the biological differences are things like lactose tolerance, which has actually popped up on 3 different continents and 3 different societies, all with a history of dairying. Hello, and welcome to your lecture on social organization and warfare. Now, in order to have warfare, we have to have some sort of group level competition, which means that we need to accept that groups exist. And cultural groups certainly exist. That's what this class is about, all of the different things that cultural groups do differently. However, these cultural differences, even though they might be inherited from person to person, they're not inherited genetically. They're inherited via social transmission of accepted behaviors. So, as we've seen in our lecture on race, class, and ethnicity, we know that most of the differences, by far most of the differences, are cultural differences in human societies. So this graph is showing you the frequency of differences between groups. Gray bars represent cultural traits, black bars represent biological genetic traits, and as you can see, the gray bars are pretty much what accounts for any sort of group differences. The black bars are limited to things like lactose tolerance, which can vary between groups, but lactose tolerance has evolved separately on 3 different continents with 3 different societies, all with a history of dairying. So even though we might see biological differences between groups, we still can't separate groups based on biological differences. Okay, so cultural groups exist, and then we also accept that they compete, and this is true. Most places around the world we see a lot of different group competition. In fact, levels of violence between humans have been continually decreasing since they've been recorded. But we do see violence between political entities, and groups definitely have differential success. This is usually local success, meaning you're beating your neighbors, but it can also be global success in terms of colonizing areas where other people already live. And political entities, as we know from our last lecture, can include communities, can include districts and regions, and can also include nations. So let's talk about an example of warfare before we get into the main question of this lecture today, which is, why do people do war differently? In South Sudan in Africa, by the early 1900s, one tribe of folks who call themselves the Dinka, well, tribe, their populations in the millions, had nearly vanquished their Nuer neighbors. These 2 societies live in the same environment, they use the same technology, they are both pastoralists, and they descend from common ancestors. So what was going on in one group compared to another that allowed them to be so differentially successful? Well, it actually comes down to kinship. The Nuer maintain larger herds and base their group membership on patrilineal descent. So I meant to say the Nuer are conquering the Dinka. The Dinka have smaller herds and base their group membership on the residence at water holes, which means that Nuer tribes can grow up to 3 to 4 times bigger than Dinka tribes. As they coalesce lineage memberships going back further and further through the generations, they can simply muster more people to show up on the battlefield or to participate in cattle raids. And if you look at how much they've expanded over, by the time that the warfare stopped, you can see the Nuer had expanded to a territory at least twice their own size. So if you want to pause the video here for a second and just think about, you're welcome to write it down, think about how do you think subsistence strategies affect warfare practices. So of course we're going to be connecting warfare to things like politics and kinship, but I always like to start with subsistence from our cultural ecology perspective. That is often associated with things like population density, resource surplus, and mobility, all of which are affect warfare. So pause the video. Okay, great. Let's see what I have on my slides, and you can compare what you think to what I've put here. So foragers don't have warfare as we tend to think of it. Modern day populations have mostly lived there because agriculturalists and pastoralists have pushed them off more desirable lands. Um, as a result, with relatively little density of resources, people are highly mobile and they have little material property. And because they live in marginal environments, they have strong norms for exchange between groups, which means that it's hard to raise a lot of people. There's not a lot to fight over, and you're going to want to be nice to your neighbors because that's what's going to benefit you more in the long run. So we don't see warfare as with larger groups. It's usually limited to homicides or feuds. Of course, this doesn't mean that in the distant past, when foragers were living in more desirable territories, they couldn't participate in warfare. We just currently don't have any data for that. Horticulturalists, the slash and burn, Swidden, small-scale gardeners, do participate in a lot of competition for local resources in a variety of ways. A lot of times you'll see members of horticulturalist groups engaged in feuds, so the state of recurring hostilities between family groups or groups of kin. And these are usually motivated to avenge an offense, and so you'll see complementary aggression on both of the feuding families. They also participate in raids. These are the short-term use of force, previously planned and organized to realize a limited objective. And in groups like the Yanomamo and others living in the Amazon, a lot of times these raids are to go and steal women, but also sometimes to raid personal property, and often to avenge an offense in a feud-like manner. And of course, once a raid has been perpetrated on you, then you are required to go and avenge that raid yourself. Oftentimes these raids will happen in the middle of the night as war parties, or not war parties, but raiding parties sneak out of the village around sunset and lie in wait outside of the enemy village until night has fallen and everyone's asleep, and then go in and raid the village. In some societies in the Amazon, male death rate by death from raiding is about 50%. So it can be very high. I haven't talked with these folks personally, but I would imagine that there is some glory to be had in being a good raider, and we'll see that later on in the presentation. But at the same time, most people are not totally happy about this possibility. And more rarely do horticulturalists participate in large-scale confrontations, and this is more likely to happen in places like Papua New Guinea, where the population density is higher. And large-scale confrontations are basically, small battles with a large number of persons, 100 to several hundred people showing up on a field for battle. And there's strategies for attack and defense and rituals associated with beginning and ending conflict. So, for example, among the Dugamdani, nobody drinks any water in the morning of a battle, and when everyone's just too thirsty to continue fighting, then the battle ends for that day. Pastoralists, as a mobile population with easily stolen goods, are often involved with raids. In fact, raiding cattle is one of the accepted ways to increase your stock, and folks oftentimes have large sharing networks as well to help them rebound from cattle raids. Folks in pastoralist populations are often caught up in cultures of honor, which is what we talked about on the very first day of class. These cultures where if someone makes a small slight to your honor, you have to respond in an unbalanced way to demonstrate that you will avenge yourself of them if they do something like try to steal your cattle. You want to present a fearsome appearance. Unfortunately, the manufacture of modern weaponry, like the AK-47, means that death rates by cattle raids are also increasingly escalating among populations who are still pastoralists today, as they now complete raids with guns. And a lot of times it's folks like young men and teenage boys who are caught in the crossfire. And it's also women and young children can be indirectly harmed if their ability to move from camp to camp to follow resources and relatives and cattle populations is hindered by the threat of violence. And yet, if you are a pastoralist living in these populations, this is the route to success. Defending your herd and stealing more cows to increase it. For agriculturalists, large-scale warfare is possible on the measure of thousands, tens of thousands. As population densities increase and available resources are diverted to maintaining armies, folks might go in search of resources elsewhere. Agriculturalists have often been at odds with neighboring subsistence strategies. If you can raise an army of tens of thousands, you can easily beat both the Dinka and the Nuer. And of course, many examples of agriculturalist warfare from medieval Western Europe and prior to that. So this is a picture from the Battle of Thermopylae, as obviously historically reenacted of the Persian expansion into Greece. For industrialists, very large warfare is highly possible with armies into the millions. And it is much larger in scale, but also much less frequent in occurrence than the other types of warfare and raiding. And I don't want to talk too much about that because I think more interesting, the question is how do we do it? If you look at other animals, the only other species that can create armies as large as ours are the social insects, like ants, bees, and wasps. So it is a really relevant question, how do we do it? If you look at the size of, say, quote-unquote armies that other animals can raise, they're usually about, well, for chimpanzees, they're about 10 individuals. And you can see a territorial raiding party here on the right. These are folks who are close kin and who are regularly interacting with one another. But the problem is these mechanisms can't explain warfare on a large scale like for humans. Something different about our abilities that allows us to raise and maintain large-scale armies. And I can't even watch the Planet of the Apes movies because it just drives me crazy. It's never going to be possible. Sorry to destroy anyone's dreams. Chimpanzees and orangutans and gorillas will never be able to go to war, at least not in this, I don't know what the word is, for a million years. Not for a million years, at least. That would be my guess. Okay, so I wanted to explain the problem a bit with this video clip from Golden Balls.
Okay, this is serious, life-changing money. Your jackpot today is £100,150. You have one final decision to make. Easy decision. We're now going to play split or steal. I know you're the last two people in the country I have to explain this to, but you have two final golden balls. You each have a golden ball with the word split written inside. You each have a golden ball with the word steal written inside. You will make a conscious choice of choosing the split or the steal ball. If you both choose the split ball, you split today's jackpot of £100,150 and you go home with £50,075. If one of you splits and one of you steals, whoever chooses the steal ball will go home with £100,150. And the person who chooses the split ball goes home with nothing. If you both choose the steal ball, you go home with nothing. Okay, Before I ask you to choose, I want you to look at your two golden balls and make sure you know which is the split ball and which is the steel ball. This is very important. Make sure you don't show each other. Before I ask you to choose, I think you have some talking to do to each other.
Stephen, I just hope they weren't puppy dog tears and they were real tears and you were genuinely going to split that money.
I am going to split this. That's 50,000. I'm just, it's unbelievable. I'm very, very happy to go home with
You were
50,000.
genuinely going to split.
If I stole off you, every single person there would run over here and lynch me.
There was no way I could. I mean, everyone who knew me would just be disgusted if I stole.
When people watch this, they're not going to believe it.
Please.
I can look you in the, Sarah, I can look you straight in the eye and tell you I am going to split. I swear down to you, I am going to split. Okay. This is serious money. It is. Sarah, Steve, choose either the split or the steel ball now. Hold it up. We're going on with 50 grand each. I promise you that. Split or steel? You never know what's coming in this game. Congratulations, Sarah, you have just won £100,150. Stephen, I'm so sorry. Commiserations, you've lost. Okay, so an unfamiliar feeling for one of you, but a horribly familiar feeling for the other. This has been Golden Balls. Until next time, goodbye. Golden Balls has taught me that some people look for revenge quite easily, and greed obviously knows no bounds.
When Stephen revealed the split ball, I wasn't proud. I didn't feel happy about what I'd done, but having been stabbed in the back last time, I just couldn't put myself through it again.
Okay, so what Golden Balls teaches us is that it takes several people to cooperate together to create a raiding unit, or several million people cooperating together to raise an army. And there's a cost and benefit to your participation. Benefit, if you can raise an army, you can defeat a neighboring society, take over their resources, possibly take advantage of their labor if you can somehow coerce them to do your bidding. Cost, injury, and death. So, how do you get people to weigh the costs and benefits in ways that would promote their participation? And we can actually use a rudimentary version of game theory. And don't be scared by hearing the words game theory. It just means that when you think about making your decision, should you split or steal, should you join the army or not, it means that your decision is contingent on other people's decision. That's all the game is in game theory. So I wanted to talk through the prisoner's dilemma. You and your friend have been arrested for a crime. The police don't have enough evidence to convict you for both of that crime, but they can convict you for a lesser one. And they're going to offer you a deal. They're going to say, if you rat your buddy out, you can go free. If you stay silent, you might potentially get a slap on the wrist. But if you stay silent and your friend rats you out, then you're going to go to jail for a long time. So the question is, you know your options, you know your friend's options, what do you do? And we can put it into a decision table like this. Let's just look at your options, which are in the cooperate column. Okay, I'm sorry. Your options, yes, your options are in the column on the left. Your options are cooperate and remain silent, or defect, meaning rat your friend out. And across the top, you can see that your friend has the same options. Cooperate and be silent, or defect and they can rat you out. And we put the outcomes in the boxes where those rows and columns intersect. So if both of you remain silent, you get 6 months in jail, slap on the wrist. And if your friend also remains silent, they get 6 months in jail, another slap on the wrist. If you rat your friend out, and they remain silent, you go free, but they go to jail for 7 years. If you both rat each other out, you're both going to go to jail for 5 years. And if you remain silent while your friend says it was your fault, you're going to go to jail for 7 years and they will go free. So the question is, what do you do here? The easy way to search for a solution is to look at your friend's options and think, what would be the best option for them? What's going to have the best payoff from their point of view? And that is to go free. So, in a Machiavellian world, you would assume that they would choose that option because that's the best payoff for them. And now you have a choice. If you assume they're going to defect, you can either cooperate and go to jail for 7 years or rat them out and go to jail for 5 years. And we would predict the outcome would be you would both defect and rat each other out. And this is why chimpanzees can't raise armies, because the assumption is without any sorts of communication or kinship, we expect the default to be rat each other out, not to cooperate, not to pay a small cost, and work together. So this is just summarizing what I said. The highest payoff is if you defect and the other person cooperates, but if both individuals use this strategy, everyone will defect. And then the question becomes, how can you sustain a cooperation with a payoff like the prisoner's dilemma? How can you convince everyone to cooperate and participate in an army when it makes much more sense to let everyone else go to war and benefit from their participation? And the answer is in social interactions. The things that we can do differently from chimpanzees is we have culture, we have government, we have social structure. We have language, although in Golden Balls, being able to talk to one another didn't help much in the long run. But we have lots of mechanisms by which we can incent cooperation beyond the simplistic structure of this game. And before I want to talk about the solutions, I want to talk about what the prisoner's dilemma looks like at a larger population level. If you have to play the prisoner's dilemma with, let's even say 100 people, all 100 people have to cooperate to get the good outcome, the beneficial outcome for everyone. We call that a tragedy of the commons. And it's called a tragedy of the commons because there's a story that goes along with it. You imagine there's a town pasture that's open to anyone to herd their animals on. Every herder has, 10 cows or whatever. And the problem is, if you herd too many cows onto the pasture, then it's going to get overgrazed and everyone's cows will die. So you ask yourself, I would benefit by putting another cow in the pasture. Do I add another cow or do I hold back and cooperate with everyone? And according to our predictions from the prisoner's dilemma, we would expect everyone to eventually add more animals, think about their own personal short-term benefit, and not cooperate because everyone else's cooperation with so many people is hard to count on. So eventually the pasture is overgrazed and you get that prisoner's dilemma type payoff where everyone defects and no one cooperates. And then we ask, how do we get the herders to limit the cows? How do we get people to join an army? Armies and pastures are both resources that we call public goods. And these are resources that everyone can benefit from using, but you can't exclude others from using. So you all get benefits for cooperation, but there are personal costs. An example of a public good is the Ogallala Aquifer. This is a huge underground lake underneath the states of South Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, all the way south down into Mexico and Texas. And anyone can pump water out of the aquifer. It benefits everyone not to pump because then the water stays in the aquifer for when you need it. But you can't exclude people from pumping, and you personally benefit if you remove water from the aquifer to do things like water your farm. Right in the middle here where a lot of the red and orange is, that's where the Dust Bowl happened. So we can look at what's happening to the aquifer over time. Blue means that there's water flowing into the aquifer. Yellow, orange, and red and dark red reflect that water is flowing out of the aquifer. And it looks like people are behaving exactly as we would predict for this public good. Everyone's pumping for personal benefit, and there's very few areas where water is actually flowing back in and refilling the aquifer. So eventually the pasture will be overgrazed. Eventually the aquifer will run dry because people are unable to coordinate for the cooperative payoff of maintaining the aquifer. Another example of a public goods game is standing armies. We will play the public goods game in class. Bring your activity sheets on December 2nd, but I'm going to skip over this and we're going to talk about how warfare requires group cooperation first. So, like with the prisoner's dilemma, your contribution to the public good is the amount you participate in war. And you can think, would you give everything? Would you defect and let your fellows fight for you? Are there some people you would expect would be acceptable to defect? And why do you think these things? And when we play the game, we're going to think about how we can change the game to get more people to cooperate for things like armies, but yes, but also for things like the Ogallala Aquifer. Because the principle is the same. So modern armies actually use a lot of mechanisms that anthropologists talk about to build cooperation within and between units. So first of all, fighting units tend to be small, nested units in larger hierarchies, so you actually know everyone that you're fighting with. This would be something like the chimpanzee raiding parties, where you actually have a relationship with folks that you're fighting with. On top of that, these small nested units have bonding rituals to increase the likelihood of your cooperating with your unit members. A lot of times there's also fictive kin terms associated with these units, so your brothers or sisters in arms structure faux kin relationships with other folks in the army. There's appeals to patriotism, so doing it for the good of the group. There is often in-group, out-group distinctions, so there's stories about what good and deserving your group is, how bad and undeserving the other group is. This might include slang terms applied to members of the other group, and general reasons for the glorification of your cause. A lot of times armies also punish defectors, so if you go away without leave or defect in other ways, sometimes a little punishment can prevent folks from defecting. And I'm sure many of you who have served in the armed forces can think of many other ways that we've talked about in here that anthropological mechanisms can help support modern armies. Cross-culturally, the more war a society has, we often see a socialization of aggression in young boys in that society. And likewise, there's often associated higher rates of homicide and assault within those societies. This is what I wanted to talk about. Along with 2 slides ago, mechanisms to support warfare. A lot of times we also see rituals, so ceremonies to create social bonds, to reinforce cooperation, and mechanisms to reduce conflict within armies. So this could include matching uniforms. These are pictures of the first standard military uniforms were invented in 1693 for a Swedish king, Karl XI. Helps you identify who your allies are so you can avoid harming them. We've also seen the implementation of rules that limit time spent fighting and to increase the fairness of fights between groups. Unlike with other structured group competition, there's often rituals before and afterwards by members of those groups to help ask for and recover from a beneficial fight or a non-beneficial fight. And a lot of these rituals we can see in the Dugumdani, who live in Papua New Guinea here, just this large island off the north coast of Australia. I've talked about them a lot. Mountainous territory, high population density, and large-scale conflict. So these are the folks in Anka's Big Maka, well, different group, but same area, Anka's Big Maka. They're very concerned about raiding with nearby villages. And the way they do large-scale conflict actually is very reminiscent of medieval Western Europe, although there's fewer combatants. It's armies on the size of 100. It's not thousands or tens of thousands. So they have shifting alliances and confederations between groups. They fight in a ritualistic way with 3 lines of assailants, warriors at the front, those who just left the front line or who are about to join it in the back, and then non-combatants watching from the far back. They have rules: no fighting at night or in the rain. They have rules limiting what weapons they can use, spears and arrows. And as I said, they take a rest at the middle of the day where everyone rehydrates. And their ceremonial dress associated with going to war. People have smaller groups within the larger groups. Um, Social status is wrapped up in your fearsomeness while fighting. And the death rate from participating in these conflicts is, fairly high. So what are people fighting over? We think about the benefit of warfare, meaning the benefit of cooperating as part of an army is that you get some sort of resource. The cost is you get injured or you die. And so we think, well, what are the resources folks are fighting over? Well, it might be physical resources like cattle or land. It can also be social resources like respect, or economic resources like money and treasure. But we can look at some patterns of warfare, one of which is warfare and gender. Men are more likely to participate in war around the world than women. Possibly this is mitigated by the fact that in general men have higher testosterone levels, and testosterone is associated with aggression and competition, although there's lots of women who have higher testosterone levels than men, so it's hard to make that generalization. Marriage and residence patterns are likely culprits. Around the world, women are more likely to reside patrilocally, meaning they're getting married and moving away from their home into their husbands' families and communities, which means that they're not around people they've known for a long time, so it's harder to cooperate with non-kin and strangers. Oftentimes, men are going to war, or at least raiding and participating in conflicts to gain access to women. So they're trying to skew the sex ratio towards more women. And also the reasoning around the world has been given that warfare is incompatible with reproduction and childcare. Now, I'm a little skeptical of all of these reasons because there's plenty of examples where women go to war and succeed very well at war. But these are the reasons given by military elites in Europe, if you're interested in pausing the video and looking at them. But my takeaway is that these are culturally cited reasons, and not necessarily, and definitely not biological limitations for who can and can't participate in warfare. Just another one of the ritualistic aspects of who can fight when and how. So finally, I wanted to close with a slide on the Yanomamo, one of those horticultural societies in the Amazon. They participate in raids and small-scale conflicts between adult men. And warriors who have killed more individuals tend to have more wives and more kids. Low-status men who have not distinguished themselves in combat tend to be polyandrous. So men who distinguish themselves in combat have multiple wives, and men who do not tend to share wives with other men. Women get married into their husband's village, and so they might not wish to fight other villages if they have kin there, and they might have a harder time cooperating with their in-laws. And we definitely see in the society that boys are socialized to be aggressive. And there's a variety of mechanisms to structure personal conflict as well as inter-village raiding. So there's many cultural aspects to exactly how the Yanomamo do warfare. Okay, I hope you're keeping up with the reading, and we'll see you next week.